and welcome back to another episode of Math. Today, we're going to be a little bit negative, and we're going to be talking about negative numbers. Now, in previous videos, I've asked you, what is a negative number? And the way I discussed it is that what separates something like positive 2 from negative 2 is their direction from 0, right? 2 and negative 2 both have the same magnitude or the same distance from 0, right? This is 1, 2 away, and this is 1, 2 away from 0, which is why they both have 2's. However, it's just the direction that differs, which is why we indicate going to the left of 0 with a negative. And so we can use this negative to basically indicate an opposite direction. If right is positive, left is negative. If up is positive, down is negative. If north is positive, south is negative, and so on and so forth, right? So basically we have two directions when it comes to numbers. So that's one way of viewing what a negative number is. However, I'm going to introduce some other ways of viewing negative numbers. And these are going to be some perspectives that you're going to find are quite useful as you become mathematical masters. So let's crack on. All right, so the first perspective I'm going to say is subtraction. So what does it mean to express a negative number as subtraction? If I were to take a number line here, and let's say I subtract 3 from this number line, right? So I subtract 3. What is that going to do? That's going to shift this number line over 1, 2, 3 units to the right. But what do we see? We see that 0 lines up with negative 3. So the subtracting of negative 3 is actually reflected where 0 lines up with. 0 lines up with negative 3. If instead I subtracted negative 7, I'd be moving the 7 units to the left, and 0 would line up with negative 7, which is the amount I subtracted it by, right? So what we can see then is that negative numbers, we can actually think of them as subtraction. So instead of thinking of just negative 3, that's the same thing as thinking of 0 minus 3, right? 0, move it over 3. That's subtracting 3. It lines up with negative 3, right? So negative 3 is actually 0 minus 3. Negative 7, that's 0 minus 7, right? I move this to the left by 7. That's subtracting 7. We see that 0 lines up with negative 7. So we can express this number, this negative number, as actually the subtraction of 0 minus something else. All right, and let's do another example. What's negative 1,000? Well, that's the same thing as 0 minus 1,000, right? So we're basically expressing all of these negative numbers as just 0 subtract another number. And one reason this perspective is useful is it kind of gives some insight into what a negative actually is. A negative can be thought of basically as some sort of displacement from 0 to the left, right? So we're moving away from 0 by this amount to the left, which gives us this number, negative 3. We're moving away from 0 by 7 to the left because it's subtraction, which gives us this number, negative 7. So through this, we can think of these negative numbers as essentially being subtraction. All right, so that's our first perspective, which is subtraction. Our next perspective is going to be multiplication. So I'm claiming that we can think of a negative number as being multiplication. Let's see how this works. Well, hopefully you already know this, and if not, we talked about this in a previous example video, that a positive times a negative, what is that? That's a negative, right? That means we can kind of think of a negative number as being a positive number times a negative number. So if I want to consider negative 5 as being a positive times a negative, one nice way of doing this is to consider this being as positive 5 times negative 1. Okay, so we're seeing that we have positive 5 times negative 1 gives us negative 5, right? We know a positive times a negative is a negative, but we're re-expressing just this negative number as being some sort of operation. Negative 6, that's 6 times negative 1, right? So we have negative 6, which is 6 to the left of 0, but we're kind of expressing this as 6 times negative 1. And what can we think of this as? If we consider these number lines here, if we consider 6 times negative 1, well, we saw in the last video that applying a negative basically flips our number line, right? So when we apply one negative, our 6 lines up with negative 6, right? But we can also think of that application of a negative as multiplying by negative 1. So if we think about it this way, we kind of get how these numbers are really just starting with the positive version and then applying a flip, which we're expressing here as the multiplication by -1. So another example would be, let's say, -4. Well, that's 4, right? And then we're applying the negative, and that lines up with -4. So applying that negative is doing 4, and we're multiplying by -1. So we can think of that flipping as basically multiplying by -1, and that's another way we can express negatives, as multiplying by -1. So if we wanted to consider -2, if we want to think of this negative as being a shifting to the left from 0, then we can think of it as subtraction, where it's basically 2 to the left of 0. If we want to think of this negative as the flipped version of 2, we can think about it as 2 times -1. It all depends on how we want to think about our negatives. Subtraction is like expressing our negative as being moved to the left of 0, and multiplication is like expressing our negative as basically taking the positive version and flipping it. So you may be wondering, what about addition, or what about division? Can we express negatives through addition and division? Well, we can, but it's just not as convenient as subtraction and multiplication. For example, we know that we can express subtraction as addition, right? That's the same thing as 0 plus the negative version of the number, right? Because positive moves us to the right, but then adding this negative in for the 2, that changes the direction we were going to go and moves us to the left, right? So the 0 minus 2 is the same thing as 0 plus -2. It's just this idea maybe isn't as useful to think about as 0 minus 2. And then for division, we could also think about -2 as being 2 divided by -1. Since what's a positive divided by a negative? It's a negative, right? So that's another way that we can think about negative numbers as being a positive divided by -1. But again, these are the most common ones to think about because this represents us moving to the left and this represents us doing a flipping. Whereas these ones aren't as easy to think about in such a straightforward way. Alright, well, it was a shorter lesson today, but I hope it made sense, and I hope you are starting to think about negative numbers in new and different ways, and see what else you can think about in different ways. I'm sure we're going to explore it together at some point in the videos, but it's also fun to think about these things on your own. So really start considering plus, minus, divide, multiply. What do these mean? What can you do with them? How can you think about these? That's what we've been doing this whole time, right? Adding and subtraction, being shiftings, multiplying, dividing, being stretching and compressings, right? There's so many different ways of thinking about these, and that's why these are so darn useful in everyday life. You can just think about them in so many different ways. Well, that's going to do it for me. Have a good one, stay groovy, and I'll see you in the next video.